Testing your code is generally a good idea, but choosing which test to use in Flutter can get confusing. Specifically, when should you use widget tests versus unit tests, since they often overlap? Here are some questions we will answer. What is a unit test? What is a widget test? When to use which? And don't widget and unit tests sometimes test the same logic? We have a simple framework for how you should think about these. When you write unit tests, you should think about inputs and outputs. When writing widget tests, think about actions and their results. Before we explain this framework and how to apply it, let's ensure we understand what a unit and widget test is. A unit test is for testing a small unit of code in isolation. Typically, a unit is a function or method. Here is the simplest example I can give. This method takes two inputs, adds them together, and returns the output. Here are some example tests you would use to verify that this function acts the way you expect. Notice that we handle edge cases like negative and big numbers. Widget tests are more cumbersome than unit tests. While unit tests test a single function, or unit, widget tests verify the widget functions correctly. Let's take a counter widget as an example. We use the MVVM architecture here, which we teach in the Best Flutter course. The view model contains the business logic for the counter, and this widget interacts with the view model to increment and display the value. It is very similar to the Flutter starter application, but with MVVM. Widget test for this widget might look something like this. We first ensure that the counter starts at 0, and then when the button to increment is tapped, we ensure the value increases accordingly. You might have noticed that there was no unit test written in the counter example. The increment counter method has not been tested, but it also kinda is. Let's finally get to the actual framework and how to think about which test to use for what situation. For unit tests, think of inputs and outputs. Now, what do we mean by this? Let's return to the first example with the sum function. This function is self-contained and only handles inputs and outputs. That means that as long as I don't change this function, I can change any other code in my application, and this function and its test will never fail. The only time the test will fail is if I change the logic for how to do addition. In short, you shouldn't break all your tests when you refactor. When we tested the increment action in the widget test, this was not checking inputs and outputs. It relies on other files in the application, like the view model, so it's not self-contained. It also doesn't really have inputs. Instead, actions are tested to ensure they give the expected results. The widget test does the action of tapping on the button, which results in the number going up. Although we are testing the counterpage widget, it also tests the view model business logic for incrementing and the correct use of the value notifier. There's no reason to write a unit test for the counter logic here, since the widget test already covers it. If I happen to refactor the view model to use a change notifier, nothing here would break. Since we are not directly unit testing the increment method. Instead, we are asserting on the result. The widget test in this scenario had a higher value than a single unit test. Using a single widget test, we have 100% coverage for the view model. All of this is done without a single unit test. So, why should we use this framework? Sometimes business logic is important to test. You want to make sure the inputs give the correct output every time. However, for most apps, testing that the user's action leads to the correct result makes sense. The upsides are that you can more freely refactor. You have a clear approach for when to use what. There is less overlap between unit and widget tests. The only downside is that widget tests are slower than unit tests. But this is very hard to justify, given the upsides. I want to make it clear, though, that there are certain scenarios where you can break out of the framework. As with anything in coding, nothing is set in stone. But this approach makes it very clear for us when to use unit versus widget tests. So, in short, unit tests test for whether you get the correct outputs given the inputs. Widget tests test whether you get the correct results given the actions. So, don't sleep on widget tests. Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to build production-ready Flutter apps, check out our course at hungrymind.com.